Hello. We've looked at the concept of informed consent now. Now we'll look at a particular context of its application. The legal concept of mature minors. An increasing number of states are accepting minor refusals, say adolescents' refusals for life-sustaining treatment. Lady Friedman Ross, an attorney, is the author of our article, Against the Tide, Arguments Against Respecting a Minor's Refusal of Efficacious Life-Saving Treatment. We'll read another article by Ross later on when we get into organ transplantation. Ross, just from the outset, Ross is opposed to the use of the mature minor concept. She has a positive view as to why this is. She calls it the constrained parental autonomy. That's her positive view of why it ought to be rejected. It's basically that parents have the obligation of making decisions for their minor children, period, as constrained by what we'll see later on. But she also says she has her own view about this, but she's also saying that the concept of mature minors, which has been recognized in the law, is not used consistently. So she starts out giving us a couple of examples of this. Let's take the time to look at them. In October of 1994, Billy Best, a 16-year-old adolescent from Boston, made national television skateboarding in Texas. Billy had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease earlier that year. After 5 sessions of chemotherapy, he had lost 20 pounds in his hair. Billy had observed his aunt die after chemotherapy made her sick, and he too felt the chemotherapy was killing him. He decided to run away after he was told that most of the cancer was gone, but that he would need to continue chemotherapy and receive radiation therapy over the next 4 months. A self-described born-again Christian, Billy packed his bag, his skateboard, and $300 into a small duffel bag, left home, and put his life in God's hands, as he put it. His parents, heartbroken and stricken with fear, made an appeal in the national media for him to come home and promised not to force more chemotherapy on him. When Billy returned from Houston to Boston, he and his parents met with the oncologist and explained that they would seek out complementary and alternative medicines and use prayer. The physicians reported the family to the Department of Social Services, which tried to have Billy removed from his parents' custody and have treatment forced upon him. The state of Massachusetts dismissed the case after intense media coverage of the case. Although initially the claim was that Billy would probably die without treatment, the physicians eventually acknowledged that he had received enough chemotherapy that he had a good chance of survival. Billy and his family, on the other hand, claimed that he was cured by the complementary and alternative medicine and prayer. 14 years later, Billy is, according to his own website, healthier than ever. He takes 2 to 4 ounces of Essiac a day to keep his immune system boosted, and also does at least 2 21-day cycles of 714X per year for the same reason. And so, let's see. Another example, November 2007, Dennis Lindbergh, a 14-year-old Jehovah's Witness with leukemia, was granted the right by a Washington state court to refuse a blood transfusion, even though the refusal was expected to kill him. Dennis was supported by his aunt and legal guardian, Diana Minchin, who was also a Jehovah's Witness. Less than 12 hours later, Dennis was dead. The trend is clear. Ross says the courts are becoming more tolerant of permitting efficacious treatment for minors with life-saving illnesses. Ross, as I said, will argue that the courts are mistaken. Now, it's interesting. She hasn't. It'd be good if she had discussed this in more depth. Remember, we looked at understanding as one of the requirements of an informed consent and how difficult that concept is. We also looked at competence. It's important that we distinguish between autonomy and competence. Autonomy is self-direction, general self-direction, the general capacity to make decisions for oneself. Competence is understood to be task-specific. So while autonomy is global, competence is local. So, for example, somebody might be competent to decide, say, in an extended care facility, what to have for supper, but not competent to decide on a serious surgical procedure. This would be an instance, this takes some thought. Which is this? Both are relevant, perhaps. Can a minor, mature minor, be competent to make such a decision? We generally allow that minors are not autonomous yet, but perhaps they are competent in certain areas. This would support the court's recognition. One would think that refusing life-sustaining treatment is not like choosing what to have for supper, however. Adults, of course, have the right to refuse any treatment whatsoever. Adult parents have the right and the duty to make treatment decisions in behalf of their minor children. We can distinguish between a decision being made in behalf and on behalf. In behalf, decisions are made with respect to the person's interests. So knowing what a child or whomever we're making a decision for, what the interests of that person would be, we refer to those interests in deciding, making a decision in the place of that person. To make a decision on behalf, I'm sorry, I'm doing it the other way around. On behalf would be referring to a person who has a history of making decisions for him or herself. So on behalf, you're just a stand-in for that person in making a decision. To make a decision in behalf is not necessarily, is actually not to make reference to the actual desires of the person for whom you're deciding. This is normally what parents do. For very young children anyway, they don't refer to what their child wants in making the best decision for the child. They decide for the child with respect to their own belief as to what's best for their child. So, adult parents have the right and duty to make decisions in behalf of their minor children, but their authority is constrained by the state's interest in the child's membership in the larger community. The state has the authority to intervene when parental decisions fall below some threshold that qualifies their decision as abusive or neglectful. Often, not always, but often this has been the standard by which refusals of blood transfusion for children made by their parents have been disallowed by courts. So parents have the right to agree to efficacious treatment for their children, but not to refuse it. This is what Ross sees as problematic with the doctrine of mature minors. She says this sounds like they have no real authority in this respect, but physicians still must seek their consent formally. Incidentally, in her article, she has something like 6 tables of various possibilities for the combination of children and their parents, their wishes, and how physicians respond to these. It's very useful to make these comparisons using the tables. In pediatrics, determining who is the appropriate decision maker, she says, is particularly complicated. The presumption is that it's the parents, is being challenged in 2 ways in particular. First, it's challenged when physicians determine that parents' decisions are not in their children's best medical interest. That would be legally a determination of parental abuse or neglect. A more recent trend has been to seek to empower minors with healthcare decisions with decision-making autonomy for them. A mature minor, then, is someone who has not reached adulthood, but is treated by the state as an adult for certain purposes. And she says mature minor statutes exist in many states at this point. A mature minor would presumably be given the discretion of an adult in those areas of maturity, even when it places the child in conflict with her parents. Consider the nature of the respective judgments. When the immature minor and parents all agree to treatment, the understanding is that the parents have appropriately acted in their child's best interest, and that their child's agreement facilitates the treatment. That is, the child is given her assent. While children cannot give informed consent, it's best to seek their assent, their agreement at least, when you can. When a mature minor and her parents all can consent to treatment, the understanding is that the child has consented and the parents have corroborated the decision. In other words, the roles are reversed. And she asks, what happens when one or the other party refuses? Ross says, what actually happens, which is contrary to logical consistency, is that in the case of mature minor refusals of whatever age, if the parents consent, the physician generally sides with the parents on the basis of the child's best interest. If the child is an adolescent, she would not simply be ignored, but the effort would be made to convince her. In practice, then, the physician will generally simply side with the party who agrees to treatment. Ross says that the case of family refusal, that is, when parents and the child all refuse, this becomes the test case of decisional authority. In an increasing number of cases, courts are upholding family refusals on the basis of mature minor statutes. Ross is skeptical of what would happen if parents would not agree with a teenager in a case of a minor refusal. What actually happens when parents consent to treatment, but a minor of whatever age refuses, is that the minor is treated. One argument for this action is that the parents are acting in the child's best interest. Another is that the child is not acting maturely. Both, she says, are inconsistent with the principles of mature minors. Ross makes an argument for the strong view that when parents refuse life-saving therapy, they are not serving their child's basic medical needs, and that basic medical needs have, as she puts it, lexical priority over other interests, including religious ones. Given the inconsistency of practice with principle, an alternative model is needed, she argues, and she calls this constrained parental autonomy. Her model presumes that parents should have the authority to make life-saving decisions for their child. Parental authority, however, is not absolute, but is constrained by the respect owed to the child's increasing maturity. Respect in this context has a negative and a positive conception. The negative conception has lexical priority, requiring that parents not harm their children's basic needs. That is, that they not abuse or neglect them. The positive conception requires that parents help their child to develop the skills required to become an autonomous adult. And of course, autonomous, yes. She identifies two arguments then for overriding minor refusal. The first is that an adolescent's autonomy can be overridden to promote long-term autonomy. Unlike adults, the idea is that the adolescent's lack of experience distorts his capacity for sound judgment. Judgment is a function of experience, at least partially. Of course, it has to be admitted that many adults of long experience lack good judgment. Second, she argues that parents' interests in raising their children in accordance with their own vision of the good does not end when the child achieves some measure of decision-making capacity. Parents should retain ultimate authority to consent to effective life-sustaining treatment over their child's refusal until the age of emancipation. When effective treatment doesn't exist, courts ought to defer to parents. The justification is that parents are primarily responsible for their child's interests. Where no effective or only marginally effective treatment exists, the justification for invoking parens patriae is lacking. That is, the state's capacity to stand in for parents. Again, pediatric contexts are particularly difficult. There's a lot of disagreement in the pediatric medical community regarding the threshold of efficacy of a treatment. The variables include the likelihood of good outcomes without treatment, whether the condition is acute or chronic, whether the treatment is a one-time affair or protracted, the degree of invasiveness, whether the treatment could be delivered in an outpatient setting, how many hospitalizations would be required, and the extent to which treatment would require the separation of the child from the family. So it's important that we understand Ross's constrained parental refusal. But in general, she's saying the parents have the duty to make decisions in behalf of their child. That is informed by their own best judgment about what's best for their child, as constrained by the emerging autonomy that children have. That children deserve to be trained, as it were, to become autonomous by allowing them to make decisions for themselves in limited areas. But in general, beyond that, she is a critic of the mature minor doctrine.